In the previous segment of the course, you performed a learning activity on lease clauses from the perspectives of both the landlord and the tenant. In this segment, rent terminology is defined and applied to 3 scenarios that illustrate each type of rent structure. In this segment, we will define rent terminology used in different leases, compare the use of fixed rent, step leases, and index leases in 3 different property scenarios, demonstrate how to calculate a rent breakpoint, perform a percentage rent calculation. A commercial lease may call for the following: a fixed amount of contract rent over the entire lease term, fixed leases, rental payments that change or step up by set amounts or percentages at given dates, step leases, variable levels of contract rent based on changes in an index, index leases, variable amounts of monthly rent based on a percentage of the tenant's gross sales receipts, percentage leases, periodic changes in contract rent as agreed upon in lease negotiation. Click each tab for details about each type of lease structure. Contract rents change by preset amounts or percentages on predetermined dates, such as every year or every 5 years. Although the lease payments vary over the lease term, all payments are determined at the beginning of the lease agreement. Thus, unless the tenant defaults, all future lease payments are known with certainty when the lease is signed. Contract rent is indexed, tied to movements in a pre-specified index, usually the Consumer Price Index, CPI. For example, if general inflation in the United States economy was 3% in the year of lease commencement, monthly lease payments for the next year will be increased 3% over their commencement level. Indexation prevents inflation from eroding the real value of the tenant's lease payments, and more likely is included in long-term leases. If all else is the same, owners would prefer to include this protection against inflation in their commercial leases because, in effect, indexation passes any inflation risk from the owner to the tenant. Percentage rent is additional rent over the base rent amount that tenants pay to the owner based on the tenant's sales over a certain dollar amount. This clause frequently is found in shopping center leases, in which an owner manages and promotes the entire center and therefore should share in the tenant's profits and risk. Percentage rent usually is calculated and paid on an annual basis. A natural sales threshold or natural breakpoint is natural breakpoint equals the annual base rent divided by overage rate. Click each rent type to view their pros and cons. The total sales of $3.5 million minus the $3 million breakpoint equals an excess sales of $500,000. This excess sales amount times the overage percentage rate of 4% equals an overage rent of $20,000, which, added to the base rent of $120,000, makes the total rent $140,000. Step 1. Based on the scenario above, calculate the natural breakpoint threshold in sales. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Step 2. Next, determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 1? Step 2. Continue to determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 2? Continue to determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 3? Continue to determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 4? Continue to determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 5? Continue to determine the year the tenant will begin paying percentage rent. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. Will the tenant begin paying percentage rent in year 6? Step 3. The next step is to calculate the amount of percentage rent the tenant will pay in year 6. Round the figure up to the nearest dollar without decimal and click Submit. You've just seen how to define and apply rent terminology to different property scenarios. You also viewed and practiced making rent calculations. The next segment of this course will describe various operating expenses specified in the lease.